The Iron Leviathan. The Invention of the Submarine Ship. Chapter 1. The Vision of Elias Finch. Episode 1. A Tinkerer in New Haven. In the narrow alleys of New Haven, Connecticut, where soot gathered on every windowsill and the winter wind howled like a banshee through the trees, there lived a man who was more myth than neighbor. Elias Finch, the townsfolk said, had been born with a compass in one hand and a crankshaft in the other. They whispered that his mother gave birth to him in a foundry while his father was lost at sea, and that the child never cried, only stared with wide, curious eyes at the glowing forge fires. By the time he was 10, Elias had built a clock that could whistle Yankee Doodle at the hour. By 15, he was tinkering with a steam-powered loom that made patterns in Morse code. By 20, he had already made enemies in high places. Patent men who feared his genius, factory owners who despised his refusal to sell. But it was the sea that called him most. He'd spend hours sitting on the docks, sketching contraptions that looked like fish with iron scales and wheels for fins. Fishermen mocked him, children dared each other to touch his coat as he passed, as if he were a ghost or a saint. And yet, Elias didn't seem to mind. He was always listening, not just to people, but to machines, wind, gulls, and the distant churn of waves. He lived in a narrow 3-story building that leaned so much it looked like it had been caught mid-bow. The place smelled of oil, salt, and copper, his cathedral of possibility, as he called it. On most nights, light flickered from the top-floor windows until morning, where he could be found hunched over sketches with eyes bloodshot from sleepless invention. He was alone in his world, except for Margaret and Red. Episode 2. The Only Family Left. Margaret Finch was the mirror image of Elias in many ways. Quiet, intense, but far more grounded. Where Elias saw gears and blueprints, Margaret saw bills and consequences. She was 23, sharp-tongued, and known for her fiery speeches at the local abolitionist meetings. She had raised Elias after their parents died in a fire that destroyed half their neighborhood. Most thought she would move away, New York, maybe even Europe. But she stayed. She said her brother needed someone who believed in more than miracles and machines. Tom, Red, Keegan was Elias' best and only friend since childhood. A burly Irishman with hair like flames and fists like anvils, Red was the local blacksmith's apprentice. He didn't understand half of what Elias said, but he trusted him like a brother. Where Elias had vision, Red had hands. The two of them built contraptions no one had ever seen before. Self-firing cannons, coal-powered wagons, even a mechanical eagle that could glide from rooftop to rooftop. It was in this trio, Elias the dreamer, Margaret the realist, and Red the muscle, that the seeds of the Iron Leviathan were planted. Episode 3. Dreams of the Deep. Elias began having dreams. They came night after night, vivid as day. In them, he saw a machine swimming through the ocean's black belly. A beast of iron and fire, shaped like a whale but armored like a battleship. It didn't float. It dove, disappearing beneath the waves, invisible and invincible. In his dream, he was inside the machine, surrounded by levers and pressure gauges, listening to the heartbeat of the ocean. He didn't steer it. It moved with him, as though the machine were an extension of his own body. When he awoke, drenched in sweat and saltwater he couldn't explain, he rushed to his drafting table and began to draw. Days blurred into nights. Meals went uneaten. His hands blackened with ink and grease. Margaret watched in growing concern. Elias, it's just a dream. It's a vision, he replied, his eyes wild. It's real. The ocean spoke to me. Red raised an eyebrow. If the ocean's speaking, it better learn to pay rent. But Elias wasn't laughing. He built models out of scrap, long narrow vessels with propellers and ballast tanks. He studied fish anatomy, learned how they moved and adjusted to pressure. He corresponded with French engineers, read about David Bushnell's turtle, the Revolutionary Era submersible, and said aloud, he was only the beginning. Episode 4. The Storm over Washington. In 1860, the The clouds of war thickened over the United States. Abraham Lincoln had been elected, and the southern states whispered of secession. As militias formed and factories converted to arms production, the Navy began searching for any edge it could find. Elias saw this as a sign. He packed his blueprints into a leather case and took a train to Washington, D.C., with Margaret and Red at his side. The journey was long, and they were nearly thrown from the train when Elias couldn't stop talking about underwater warfare. At the War Department, they waited 2 days to see anyone. Finally, Elias presented his designs to a panel of Navy engineers and officers. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with excitement. He spoke of stealth, speed, and revolution. He showed sketches of a vessel that could sneak into harbors, deliver torpedoes, and vanish before anyone knew it had come. The room was silent for a moment. Then came the laughter. Submarines. One admiral snorted. Is this Jules Verne or military strategy? Even fish can't breathe down there, said another. But one young lieutenant didn't laugh. Lieutenant Nathaniel Graves had fought in Mexico and seen how technology shaped battles. He stayed behind after the others left, studying Elias' drawings in silence. Then he said quietly, "This is madness. But so was gunpowder once." He slipped Elias a card. "Come to Norfolk. We'll build it in secret." Episode 5. Return to the Sea. Back in New Haven, Elias was electric with purpose. With Graves' backing and Margaret's reluctant blessing, he rented out an abandoned shipyard outside of town. An old ironworks by the bay, covered in ivy and haunted by crows. He called it the Cradle. By moonlight and storm, they built. They hired escaped slaves fleeing the South, Irish immigrants barred from the factories, and wandering minds rejected by academia. They worked in silence, swore oaths of secrecy, and listened to Elias as if he were a prophet. The vessel they created was unlike anything the world had seen. 60 feet long, cigar-shaped, with an oaken spine and iron ribs. The outer shell was a patchwork of reinforced metal and glass. It had 2 hand-cranked propellers, ballast tanks, and a periscope made from a series of angled mirrors. Elias named it the Iron Leviathan. And when it was finished, the sea fell quiet for 3 days, as if the ocean itself was waiting. Episode 6. The Baptism of Iron. They gathered at dusk, where the fog rolled in thick and salt hung heavy in the air. The Iron Leviathan lay cradled on wooden supports in the half-flooded dry dock, a hulking beast of bolted metal and hissing valves. Lantern light flickered off its dark hull, giving it the sheen of a living thing. The workers, dozens of them, tired and oil-streaked, stood silent around it. No cheers, no speeches, just awe. Margaret stepped forward, holding a bottle of seawater in place of champagne. Elias had insisted. "No wine for war," he said. She touched the bottle to the hull and whispered, "For the peace it might win." Then she shattered it. The Iron Leviathan groaned, almost in response. They lowered her into the harbor under moonlight, a slow descent that felt like burying something sacred. For a moment, it seemed the vessel would tip. One ballast failed to engage, and the rear dropped sharply. Gasps rose. Red shouted instructions. The workers scrambled over ropes. Margaret braced herself. Then, with a sudden shunk, the vessel righted itself and bobbed once on the surface, an iron whale testing its lungs. Elias stood motionless on the dock, eyes full of storm and stars. "She breathes," he whispered. Episode 7. The First Dive. The first dive was only supposed to last 20 minutes. Elias insisted on piloting it himself, despite protests. "No one else understands her," he said. Red and 2 others, Jonas, a free black machinist, and Peter, a Dutch clockmaker's son, joined him below deck. The hatch sealed with a heavy clang. Inside, it was cramped and reeked of oil and sweat. Copper pipes ran like veins along the ceiling. Valves hissed. A faint throb, like a heartbeat, echoed from the core. Red manned the manual propeller. Peter monitored gauges. Elias moved from lever to lever, his fingers trembling not with fear, but reverence. Ballast, Elias called. Water rushed into the tanks. The Leviathan sank. Outside, bubbles trailed upward like ghostly signals. Inside, light dimmed. Pressure creaked along the hull. Elias's ears popped, and he grinned. "We're flying," he said. Episode 8. Below the surface. At 20 feet below, the world changed. All sound was muffled. Light vanished except for what their lanterns provided. Fish drifted by like spirits. The walls groaned, and condensation dripped like cold sweat. They tested the propeller, turning slowly in a wide arc. Steering was crude, but functional. The periscope showed a sliver of the moon above, fractured by waves. Then the pressure gauge spiked. One of the rear pipes hissed violently. A rivet popped. Water sprayed in. Panic surged. Red dove to the valve, hammering it shut. Jonas patched the leak with oil-soaked rags. Elias held steady, barking orders with a calm born of obsession. After 23 terrifying minutes, they surfaced. When the hatch opened, cold night air rushed in like salvation. Margaret was waiting on the dock. She saw Elias rise from the hatch, soaked but smiling. "It works," he said simply, "but it dreams of more." Episode 9. Trouble in Town. Word spread. Not of a submarine. No one called it that yet, but of something. A noise from the sea. Strange lights. A boat that vanished and returned without sail or paddle. Some locals grew nervous. A few accused Elias of sorcery. A preacher even called it Leviathan's spawn, and demanded it be destroyed. Margaret defended her brother publicly. "He's not making war. He's making an end to it." Still, the tension grew. And then came the stranger. A Confederate agent posing as a trader arrived in town. He'd heard rumors from spies in Washington, whispers of a weapon beneath the waves. He followed them to New Haven. One night, he broke into the shipyard. Red caught him. There was a struggle, a gunshot. The man fled into the woods, wounded but alive. When they searched his belongings, they found maps of the harbor, sketches of the Iron Leviathan, and coded letters. Elias stared at them in silence, then turned to Graves, who had just arrived under cover of night. "They know," Elias said. Graves nodded. "Then we must move faster." Episode 10. The Pact with the Sea. That night, Elias did not sleep. He stood alone by the water, wine tearing at his coat, whispering things only he could hear. He spoke aloud, not to the stars, but to the sea. "You've always hidden your monsters. Let me build one for you." He returned to the cradle and began modifying the Leviathan. He added a second set of ballast tanks, reinforced the hull with layers of flexible iron, and devised a primitive air recycling system. He also added something new, a central control panel that operated not by levers alone, but through a series of mechanical pulses and sounds. He claimed it would let him feel what the Leviathan felt. Margaret watched in silence. "You're not building a machine anymore," she said. "I never was," Elias answered. "I'm building a creature, a savior." Episode 11. The Devil's Interview. 2 weeks after the Confederate spy was caught, another visitor arrived. This one came not by train, nor horse, but by government dispatch, an official from the Navy, sent by the War Department to evaluate Graves' secret operation. Commander Horace Kavanaugh was a tall, fox-eyed man with sharp creases in his uniform and words dipped in vinegar. He walked through the cradle with the disdain of a man visiting a freak show. "Submersible vessel," he muttered, tapping the Iron Leviathan's hull with a gloved knuckle. "A folly of fishmongers." Graves stood firm, but Elias paced with barely contained fury. "She's faster than anything in water, invisible to the eye, immune to cannon fire. She could end the blockade in a week." Kavanaugh turned his gaze on Elias. "And you'd entrust national defense to a steam-powered coffin. Tell me, Mr. Finch, what happens when your glorified torpedo fails and your men drown like rats?" Elias stepped closer. What happens when your ships burn and your soldiers die because you refuse to see the future coming? The silence crackled like stormlight. Margaret intervened before it boiled over. In the end, Kavanaugh filed a cold, condemning report. Imaginative, but untested. Dangerous. The mind behind it, brilliant but unstable. Recommends cessation of further funding. When he left, Elias watched from the bluff, his face carved from stone. Graves put a hand on his shoulder. He doesn't speak for everyone. Elias didn't answer, but later that night, he added a final note to his blueprints. Not a machine of war, but a guardian. If they fear it, then it's because they know it will change everything. Episode 12. Baptism by Fire. The sabotage came at dawn. Explosives planted beneath the Leviathan's dry dock ignited with a thunderclap that shook the cradle. Flames shot into the sky. Half the ironworks collapsed. 3 workers died. Margaret's arm was badly burned pulling Elias from the wreckage. The hull was damaged, the propeller shattered. Panic spread. The Confederate agent, believed dead, had returned with accomplices. For a moment, everything seemed lost. But Elias refused to surrender. He rallied the crew, eyes blazing. If they fear it this much, then we are closer than we've ever been. We rebuild. We launch. Now. The workers, grieving and furious, worked without rest. Red oversaw the forge night and day. Jonas and Peter rewired the systems. Margaret, her arm in a sling, managed food, morale, and kept watch with a borrowed pistol. Within 10 days, the Iron Leviathan was ready again, scarred, but whole. Stronger. And hungry. Episode 13. The Phantom Vessel. On a moonless night, they took her out again. No ceremony. No crowd. Just Elias, Red, Jonas, and a new recruit, a former Navy helmsman named Sullivan who had lost his leg at Fort Sumter and volunteered for this madness with a smile and a wooden peg. They submerged just past the harbor, following a deep trench mapped from local legend and fishermen's tales. This time, Elias pushed the limits. 50 feet, then 70. At 100 feet, everything changed. The lights flickered. The pressure pressed in like an invisible vice. Outside the small glass viewports, the ocean was black as coal, dotted only with bioluminescent shapes that drifted like lost souls. The Leviathan hummed, not from the engines, but from something deeper. A vibration in the hull, like a tuning fork. Elias pressed his ear to the wall. He didn't speak, he simply listened. And then, slowly, the ship moved on its own. Not from controls, not from propellers. Like it was being pulled by something. Or answering something. Red shouted. Jonas tried to reroute power. But Elias stayed calm. She hears me, he said. She knows her place now. Eventually, the Leviathan returned to the surface, perfectly intact. But every man aboard was changed. Eyes wide, words hushed. They had not tested a weapon. They had woken something. Episode 14. The Letter. Back at the cradle, Margaret found a letter tucked beneath Elias's drafting compass. It was addressed simply, to those who come after. Inside were pages of notes, diagrams, and one haunting line. Greater than if I vanish beneath the waves, do not mourn. Some men are born for land, others for fire, but I was born for the dark between. She wept. But she did not stop him. Episode 15. The Tides Shift. Graves returned with orders. Not official, but desperate. A Confederate blockade runner had slipped through Charleston, carrying stolen plans for Union munitions. It would rendezvous with enemy forces near the Carolina coast in 5 days. The Navy could not intercept. But the Iron Leviathan could. Graves looked Elias in the eye. You said you wanted to change the future. This is your chance. Elias looked to Margaret. She didn't speak, just took his hand. Come back, she said. Or don't, but let them remember. Episode 16. Into the Deep. Answer. The Leviathan prepared for war. its hull reinforced, its torpedo tubes armed with hand-cranked spar bombs, its crew chosen. At dawn, it slipped beneath the water for the longest, deadliest journey yet. No fanfare, no flag. Just the silent, eternal sea swallowing the future whole. And in New Haven, they waited. Margaret watched the horizon for weeks. No word came. No ship returned. Until, one night, the waves broke with no wind. The tide changed direction, and the water hissed as if whispering something too old for language. Margaret whispered back, "Goodbye, brother." Chapter 1 ends. The legend of Elias Finch and the Iron Leviathan had only just begun.